Hi everyone, so today we're going to have a look at Carlsson et al. 2000, which was a contemporary study in clinical psychology for the Edexcel specification. So the aim of the study was to present the current view of the relationship between schizophrenia and dopamine, and also to explore an alternative view about the relationship between schizophrenia and a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Now, from previous research, obviously we know that there is a link, quite a strong link between the level of dopamine and schizophrenia. So high levels of dopamine cause the typical positive symptoms of schizophrenia. The research that was conducted by Carlsson is more of a review which sums up previous research and studies and almost sort of suggests where it should go next. So it sort of points to future sort of implications and what kind of research needs to be conducted next. It does not gather any new empirical data and as such does not follow the standard process for reporting a study. So when you're obviously asked questions about Carlsson's study in your exam, you must remember it doesn't follow your usual aim, procedure, result, conclusion, because it's more of a review of previous research. So Carlsson wanted to obviously review some other studies which looked at the relationship between neurochemicals such as dopamine levels in schizophrenia. He also looked at studies into drugs which were obviously known to induce the symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia. So he reviewed those studies as well. He found some examples of studies which showed evidence from brain scanning methods that high levels of dopamine were actually linked to mental health or schizophrenia. So Abidagam 1998, Breyer 1997. These are examples of some of the studies which showed a strong link between dopamine and schizophrenia. Many previous studies he also found were linked with recreational drugs and schizophrenia. In particular, amphetamines he found, which actually increased the level of dopamine to actually cause symptoms of schizophrenia, which sort of makes sense really, because obviously we know that high levels of dopamine do cause symptoms in schizophrenia. So amphetamines are obviously having the same kind of effect. He also found some research linking other drugs such as phencyclidine, PCP, with mental disorders. He also looked at research studies on the effectiveness of drugs to treat schizophrenia and how obviously effective drugs actually are. Now, there are two main explanations for schizophrenia. You've got hyperdopaminergia and hypoglutamatergia. So we've got hyper is high levels of dopamine, hyperdopaminergia, and hypo, which is obviously low levels, hypoglutamatergia, which is low levels of another neurotransmitter called glutamate. Now, there's not that much research on glutamate. Okay, hence why Carlsson wanted to look at this, look at the previous research on glutamate. And what they found was that the research focused on hypoglutamatergia to see where the low levels of glutamate played a part in schizophrenia. Now, glutamate is used by every excitatory information system in the brain. Between the synapses, which accounts for 90% of synaptic connections in the human brain. So it's a very important neurotransmitter. Carlsson's study basically reaffirmed the evidence which supports the dopamine hypothesis, the fact that high levels of dopamine can cause symptoms of psychosis. Also, that patients complain more about the side effects while the symptoms are in remission. And this is because dopamine activity is actually returning back to its baseline normal levels. This would reinforce the fact that drugs are actually causing hypodopaminergia, so too little dopamine. So obviously antipsychotic drugs when taken actually lower the levels of dopamine. Okay, so remember, in a schizophrenic patient that has high levels of dopamine, the aim of antipsychotic medication would be to lower that level of dopamine. Okay. Carlsson suggested that unlikely that dopamine is the only neurotransmitter that's involved in schizophrenia, and therefore he wanted to focus on the role of glutamate in particular. Previous studies that Carlsson found when looking back did obviously find a link between certain drugs such as phencyclidine, PCP, or otherwise known as angel dust, and obviously schizophrenic symptoms. But instead of activating dopamine, what they do is they stimulate glutamate receptors called NMDA. Okay. PCP, the drug, tends to block the receptor and actually is an NMDA receptor antagonist, meaning it reduces the level of glutamate. So maybe this deficiency, the low level of glutamate, has a role in schizophrenia as well. So it might not just be high levels of dopamine, but it might also be low levels of glutamate, which may cause symptoms of schizophrenia. A study by Miller and Abercrombie in 1996 found that when dopamine is released, it increases glutamate activity by blocking NMDA receptors. So when dopamine activity increases, glutamate activity is reduced. So one neurotransmitter's actions will affect the actions of the other neurotransmitter automatically. So Carlsson found that there was a relationship between the low level of glutamate and both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So remember, the positive symptoms are obviously additions to the normal behavior, such as hallucinations and delusions. And then negative symptoms are obviously a lack of something, emotional withdrawal, lack of fluent language, so disorganized language. Glutamate deficiency, so lack of glutamate or low levels of glutamate in the cerebral cortex actually can cause negative symptoms, and a failure in another part of the brain called the basal ganglia that could cause positive symptoms. Also, they found that too much dopamine or too little glutamate actually does link into some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So abnormal dopamine and glutamate activity will overstimulate the thalamus in the brain, which will starve the cerebral cortex of stimulation, and that links into the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So there is obviously a lot of different findings of Carlsson's research, because remember, it was more of a research review rather than a study that was obviously conducted himself. So collecting obviously secondary data. Carlsson concluded then, by looking at the research, a previous research, that dopamine does have a part to play in schizophrenia, an important part, but there are also other biological factors that need to be researched, and particularly talks about the role of other neurotransmitters like GABA and acetylcholine, and also neuropeptides came up in some of the research. And really, his conclusion is that further research is needed into developing drugs that do treat schizophrenia. And not just by looking at dopamine, but also looking at the role of other neurotransmitters as well, okay, such as glutamate. Now, when you evaluate Carlsson's study, obviously you are basically evaluating secondary data, because Carlsson did not collect any research himself directly. So The reliability and validity is always questionable with regards to secondary data because it's not data that you have collected yourself. Okay, and obviously a range of studies were examined and analysed, but they all had different reliability and validity controls in place. Again, the advantage of using secondary data is that it can be gathered very quickly. It's obviously less time consuming, and it's easier to really gather the data. Most of the studies that Carlsson looked at did use objective measures, such as brain scans, PET scans, which makes the studies more objective and more reliable and valid as well. Carlsson's conclusion really shows good application, as we can use the findings of his obviously literature review to develop more effective treatments for mental health disorders. A lot of the research studies which Carlsson did examine were actually based on animal studies. Therefore, this is a problem because they can't really be applied to explain the results of humans. So the results are not really generalizable to human research or even schizophrenia in humans. The focus of other neurotransmitters such as serotonin and glutamate has actually led to development of new drug treatments, which have been effective at reducing both positive and negative symptoms. So with antipsychotic medication, it's an area which is constantly developing continuously. Okay, because some medications may not work on some patients' symptoms. Therefore, research is still being carried out, and what Carlsson's really implication is that further research needs to be carried out on, the causes of schizophrenia, and we need to sort of broaden our sort of research by looking at more than one neurotransmitter. So it's not just dopamine, but there are other neurotransmitters that are also involved.